All right, good afternoon. We're delighted to be joined in person by Denise Brown, who you know, who is our resident coordinator and humanitarian coordinator in Ukraine. Denise will have some opening remarks, and then we'll take a few questions, and then I will brief.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Couple of comments from my side. First of all, I really want to highlight what are the new dimensions of the humanitarian crisis. I don't even like to use the word crisis. I'd rather refer to humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine because of the war. The first is the coming winter months. So it's not like this was unpredictable, of course, but it does mean that we're having to respond to really acute needs of the population, people who've been displaced by the war, people who've lost their homes because of the war, and now find themselves in very, very precarious situation over the winter months. So we're doing things we don't usually do. A lot of these people are in what are referred to as collective centers. They can be universities, they can be vocational training centers, they can be former orphanages, not well equipped for the winter months. So we're doing a lot of repairs. We're also, of course, looking at the hospitals and how to provide backup generators and mobile heating kits, doing some repairs in some communities at the household level and cash transfers. So, I mean, it's a really pressing need. It's already quite cold in Ukraine, particularly along in the eastern regions, and our focus is really on those oblasts which are closest to the front line and the most damaged by the war. So that's the first, what I call, new dimension to the crisis. So it's not like we continue to assist the same people since the start of the war. There's a real evolution of those who are in need. The second are the newly accessible areas that we haven't been able to get to over the past 8 months. This is particularly up in Kharkiv and also down in Kherson areas. This is extremely complicated. The contamination by mines, the extent of it is not yet known. The government is talking to us, the UN and member states, about the need to reinforce their capacity, equipment, materials, and training. A lot of these areas we're not going into until the military gives us the green light that they have done at least the humanitarian demining. So this is a risk, firstly for the population, secondly for the aid workers who are going in. The other thing is these are areas that have been seen active military operations. There's still a lot of remnants of the war, bodies in particular, that our teams who are going in have to deal with as they're moving to these communities. So we're dealing with a lot of trauma within our own humanitarian community. And the third new dimension, I was up in Balaklia, which is in Izum district, as soon as it opened. That was at least a month ago. And the community that we went to, Balaklia, predominantly an older population. So these are people with limited mobility, and their trauma was visible. And I'm used to, when I go to humanitarian distributions and provision of services, a lot of noise, a lot of movement, and it was deathly silent. It was really surprising for me. People slowly came up to speak to us, asking questions. I was with some of the local authorities, but clearly traumatized in our view by what they've been through. And so the aspect of trauma is another new dimension to this crisis. And there are the immediate acute needs that we're seeing, and there will be the longer term. I was down in Mykolaiv about 2 weeks ago, and the mayor said to me, 33 days of silence. They've had 33 days of silence since the war began. This is extremely disturbing, and we also having challenges dealing with what's going on right now in Kiev. I just want to make a last point, which is a very big concern, which is access to the non-government controlled areas, which we do not have. There's humanitarian imperative. We have not had access to this population at any reasonable scale since the war began, asking regularly to move across that front line to deliver humanitarian supplies. It's just about supporting the population. So what is going on one side of the line, and we can reach people, we see the damage, as I've just mentioned, is certainly going on the other side, and people are in need of assistance. So these are the new dimensions to the crisis. The war is not over. The humanitarian needs are growing, not diminishing, and we're having to assist new groups of the population that we weren't even a couple of weeks ago. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll go with Edie on behalf of Correspondents Association.
Thank you very much, Ms. Brown, on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association. Welcome and thank you for doing this briefing. My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. First, just a quick follow-up on what you said, your last point about not having access to non-government areas. Do you get any indication that people on the other side of the line are getting any help from Russia? And secondly, on a broader level, this week has seen a lot of drone strikes against critical civilian infrastructure and civilians. And I wondered what kind of an impact this is having on UN operations and UN plans for the winter.
Yeah, thank you very much. So in the NGCAs, we actually do have UN staff. So while we've not been able to carry out assessments or monitor what may or may not be brought in, we don't have any indication that there's any large-scale assistance being brought in. We don't have that information. On the civilian infrastructure and the recent attacks, we're spending a lot of time in the bunkers. All right, so that is definitely slowing us down, absolutely. What's going on in places like Zaporizhia and most recently also up in Kharkiv and Dnipro, it means our staff, their mobility is also restricted. We have to follow very closely the government instructions for everybody, which is when the siren goes on, you enter the bunker or you stay put and you don't come out until the siren is off. And particularly given the attacks over the past 2 weeks, we are very carefully following that. So yes, it reduces our mobility and slows us down in our response.
James?
James Bays, Al Jazeera. I'd like to come back to access again. You talk about non-government controlled areas. They were formerly separatist controlled areas. They are now areas controlled and annexed by Russia. So we know exactly who is controlling them. What has been your outreach to the Russian Federation? What are they telling you about access? Why are they not letting you have access to those areas? And just to cover both sides here, are you having any access problems from the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian military? Are there areas that they don't let you go to?
So we very, very regularly submit note verbal to both Russia and Ukraine requesting authorization to move across the front line. It's absolutely imperative. The response from the Ukrainian side is almost always positive. Yes, move across, unless they feel like there are immediate security impediments that we should not be moving. And unfortunately, on the Russian side, for the moment, the request has always been turned down. As I'm based in Ukraine, I don't engage in the discussions with Russia. That is more for the USG, Martin Griffiths, and those discussions are ongoing. And I will remain hopeful until the very end that humanitarian imperative will win out and that we will be allowed to cross the front line for humanitarian purposes. So that's the state of play for the moment.
Just a quick follow-up. I'm assuming there is a resident coordinator of the UN in Moscow as well. And given they say these areas are now Russian, are you working it from that side too?
That side is handled through Martin Griffiths, the Undersecretary General, who, as you know, was also in Moscow this week. So I leave that in Martin's hands and the team in Moscow.
Does he shoot China Central Television?
Hi, James just asked my question.
Oh, excellent. Tell it, please.
It's very useful that
Yeah.
Hi, Ms. Brown. My name is Natalie Lutenko. I'm from Ukraine, ICTV station. I just question about the very hard question about the kids that were forcibly taken to Russia. Are you trying to get any information from Russia? As you may know, recently Russians took forcibly from Kherson for so-called treatment. All the families with kids. Do you have any access and information? How are you trying to track these kids, Ukrainian?
No, thank you. Thank you very much for the question. My responsibilities are within Ukraine. So whatever then is happening inside Russia, this is again for UNHCR, the Undersecretary General, Martin Griffiths to follow up on. I'm very careful about my scope of responsibility. So it's not that it's not incredibly important, but it's not an issue that I'm immediately following up on myself. Yeah.
Yes, Ibtisam?
Hi, my name is Ibtisam Azim from Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. I have a question regarding your operation in general. We know from other places in the past, like for example in Syria, where despite the fact that the UN did share that hospitals and health facilities were attacked, despite the fact that you did share that you were around in the area, etc. How much is this scenario also exist in Ukraine? How much you think about it when you operate? Did this infect your operation in Ukraine and other places? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a documentation of the number of schools that have been destroyed or occupied, as well as hospitals and clinics. We have those figures. I don't have them in my head, but we have those figures. They're also, I believe, in the OHCHR report that was issued in September. And of course, this is a big problem, which is why we're having to, for instance, on the health side with the World Health Organization and the Ministry of Health in Ukraine, with MSF as well, use mobile clinics to provide assistance to people. So yes, this is a very, very big problem. And as you know, millions of children are out of school in Ukraine. One, because of the threat, but secondly, also because of the destruction of schools. So yeah, that's a big problem and will have lasting consequences.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Kurush Ziabari, that camera's called fellow and Asia Times correspondent from Iran. It has been widely reported that throughout the course of the war, Russia has used missiles and drones that have been supplied by Iran to Russia. And the Iranian government continues to vehemently deny any supply of drones and missiles. And even yesterday, the Prime Minister was talking to the Croatian Prime Minister saying that we haven't supplied anything that can be used during the Russia's military operation and war. Are you, as the UN, in a position to be able to confirm that these drones and missiles have been provided by Iran, and there is actually concrete evidence that it is what Iran has recently done?
The only thing that I can confirm is that I see the damage caused by the missile strikes. And I was in Kiev last Monday when those strikes happened. Extensive damage, trauma, as people 8 o'clock in the morning taking their children to school. I can't answer any questions about where those drones are coming from, but I can tell you what the damage is.
Sherwin.
So let me follow up on that. Sherwin Bryce, South African Broadcasting. Talk about the scale of the damage that you're encountering. I mean, we often hear that this is a country that's being destroyed by Russian missiles. Is that borne out by what you see in terms of the extensiveness around the country, not just in the capital or in the east? Is the entire country a target now for the Russian Federation? Is that what you're seeing on the ground?
I can't tell you what the target of the Russian Federation is, but I can tell you that in the places that I go regularly, the oblasts along the front line, there's extensive damage. As you know, the World Bank and the EU have done a damage assessment survey. Now the UN, with the Ministry of Regional Affairs, is looking at the volume of debris using satellite imagery. But I can tell you, when I'm standing in Sommet in front of buildings that have been completely destroyed, it's surreal. It's surreal. And what happened last Monday in Kiev is I was sitting in my office at 8:20 and hear loud explosions and my office starts shaking. That's the damage. And that's what my eyes see, and that's what I can report on.
About the trauma, if I can just follow up, of Ukraine, that Ukrainians are suffering. I mean, what about the UN staff, the humanitarians?
Yes.
I mean, what is the trauma associated with working in a war zone like this?
We are not soldiers, but we are in the same areas as soldiers, as in many other countries. And what I said earlier about our team moving around in newly accessible areas and decomposing bodies on the side of the road, yes, it has an impact. So we have a number of staff counselors that have been brought in to provide that support, but it's very difficult. And as you know, as President Zelensky announced this morning, there are electricity cuts, and we're only in October. So we are also concerned about shortage of electricity and heating, and that will also impact the population, but also the humanitarian aid workers. We are in exactly the same position as the population. We are also at risk.
We'll go to Betül and then Frank, and then we'll go to you, James.
Thank you very much. Betül Yürük with the Turkish News Agency, Anadolu. Just a quick follow-up on what you said. Can you give us an assessment of how long it would take to rebuild, given the extensive damage you just talked about? Thanks.
No, I'm afraid I can't. This is the reconstruction plan that the government is working on, following the World Bank and the EU and government assessment. They also require the final report from the UN and the Ministry of Regional Affairs, which is not ready yet. And then I assume they will finalize their plan. But when you're standing in front of these buildings that are completely destroyed, blocks of buildings across many parts of the country, this is not for next year. This is for a very long time. How long? I don't know, but it's not for right now.
Frank Ucciardo.
Hi, Frankie Ciardo, TRT World. You talked about seeing the remnants of war. Do you believe the reason you're not getting access is that Russia doesn't want you to see the crimes against humanity that they may be committing?
I don't know. All I know is that I need access. It's humanitarian imperative. That's my job. And I have no other business to be observing anything. I just want to deliver those supplies. And that's the request that goes very frequently to both governments.
But you talk to people, they must be telling you about what has happened to them.
We are in direct contact with, of course, the people we are assisting, but I'm not an investigator. That's not my role. So I don't think there's a threat of that happening, but you'd have to ask the Russian Federation.
Just a quick follow-up on what you've been saying. You talk about the extensive damage that you're seeing in Kyiv and other parts of Ukraine. Russia talks about precision strikes on military targets. Do those words from Russia match what you are seeing on the ground? And as you know, attacking civilian targets, deliberately attacking civilian targets, would be a breach of international humanitarian law. Is that what you believe is taking place?
I can only tell you what I see. And I see apartment blocks which are destroyed by missile strikes. And last week in Kiev, a playground. That's what I see. For the rest, it's up to the experts to determine what that is a violation of.
Edie, and then we'll go to Digi.
Just a quick follow-up question on money. Do you have enough money for the programs that you're trying to implement ahead of the winter and through the winter?
Member states have been very generous. We have a $4 billion flash appeal from April to December of this year. As I said earlier, and so I'm very grateful to the member states for this outpouring of support for the population of Ukraine. I don't see the needs decreasing much given the new dimensions to the crisis, so we are hopeful that the member states will continue to fund us at the levels that are required.
Deji?
Finally, I got a question. Ms. Brown, this is Registry with China Central Television. You just mentioned about the destruction, and also from the Ukrainian government, they said 40% of the energy infrastructure has been destroyed. We know the winter is coming. Does the UN has any assessment on the impact of these energy or electricity infrastructure could impact the people in winter, and has your team prepared for that?
What my team, the humanitarian team, is preparing for is very focused on the frontline communities. So as I mentioned earlier, the winterization of the buildings, repairs of homes, provision of solid fuel, support to the hospitals, and support to schools through UNICEF. Large-scale disruptions of electricity and heating, I have to tell you, will be beyond the capacity of the humanitarian community to deal with.
Thank you. Ephraim, Arab News, and then we'll go to Stefano, and then we'll close it.
Thank you so much. On the question of money and having your humanitarian response funded and member states being generous, I wonder how you feel about the other parts of the world where, we talk about this here every day, where funding is always falling short. Places like Syria, where on top of all the problems that you mentioned in Ukraine, they also have food insecurity on top of it all. And a cholera outbreak now. So how do you feel about the fact that your mission is well funded while other humanitarian missions are not?
I just come from the Central African Republic, where I was for 3 years the Deputy Special Representative Humanitarian Coordinator, and mobilizing funding was a full-time job. At the end of the day, whether you are the victim of the conflict in Central African Republic or victim of drought, 5 consecutive failed harvests in Somalia and the Horn of Africa, or a civilian in the midst of this war, this is all about need. And our job, my job, is to ensure that wherever I am, focused on the population, focused on bringing their story, explaining what's going on, and mobilizing those resources. That's my responsibility.
Stefano, that'll be the last question.
Thank you, Stefano Vaccara, Voce di New York. I hope you can answer this question. It's about when you encounter people, regular citizens also in Kiev, how do you consider at the moment their spirit, their morale? I mean, it has been, the world has been surprised to see how the people have been resisting this horrible war. It's been always, you think that after, for example, those drone attacks and everything, are people changing? Are they, do you think their alignment with resistance with the government, with keeping fighting is still there, or there is something that is changing? What do you think about, what you can tell us about the spirit of the people in this moment in Ukraine?
I'm not Ukrainian, so I don't think I should answer the question from their perspective, but I can answer the question from the perspective of the humanitarian community in the UN, which is that these missile strikes in Kiev and Dnipro and Kharkiv and Zaporizhia are extremely disturbing. We're spending long hours in the bunkers. The sirens go off into the bunker, or you stay in the metro, and we all feel somehow affected by this. But as the UN, we have no intention of leaving. We will stay in Kiev, we will stay in Dnipro, we will stay in Poltava, we will stay in Zaporizhia, we will stay wherever we are right now. And it's going to get difficult with the winter months and the electricity rationing that was announced today. Probably, I guess, the heating will be affected as well, although the government hasn't announced that. But I think from the perspective of our team, we remain engaged and determined to support the people of Ukraine.
Great. Denise, thank you
you.
very
You're
much,
welcome. Thank
and
you.
we hope to welcome you back here soon. I'll be back in 2 minutes.